Well, thank you very much, Ellen, for inviting me here to give this talk, and thanks to all of you for coming to listen to me. Hopefully there will be time for some discussion and questions, so I'll start straight away and talk as fast as I can. I put too many pictures in because I like looking at the pictures myself. So the Red Monastery Church, which we're going to be talking about, was adopted as a heritage conservation project by the American Research Centre in Egypt in 2003. The logos underneath the title slide show USAID, United States Agency for International Development, which has funded all the work that you're going to be looking at today. And the Red Monastery project is a component of a series of grants, a program of support for the preservation of Egypt's cultural heritage, which started in 1994, and these grants have been administered by the American Research Centre, RC, ever since. It's the largest single contribution by any foreign donor that has been made towards a continuing program of cultural heritage preservation in Egypt. In the middle is RC, and on the right-hand side is the emblem of the Ministry of Antiquities here in Egypt, without whom none of this work would be possible. Our collaboration with them is essential, and all our permits are issued through the ministry. So they are as key a player in all this as USAID. Cultural heritage preservation is carried out worldwide under a series of standards and guidelines which begin in the 1930s and are internationally recognized. And one of the most influential and formative of these is the Venice Charter of 1964. And three of its articles are particularly pertinent to what I'm going to be talking about in the next hour or so. The conservation of monuments is always facilitated by making use of them for some socially useful purpose. The monument is inseparable from the history to which it bears witness and from the setting in which it occurs, and the process of restoration is a highly specialized operation. It aims to preserve and reveal the aesthetic and historic value of the monument and is based on respect for original material and authentic documents. It must stop at the point where conjecture begins, and in this case, moreover, any extra work must be distinct from the original composition and must bear a contemporary stamp. So, Sohag, the Church of St. Bishai and St. Bigol, known as the Red Monastery, is located about halfway between the north coast and the southern border of Egypt, about 3.5 hours drive north of Luxor. And zooming in closer, courtesy Google Earth, the Red Monastery, marked in red there, is located almost directly west of Sohag, which itself is west of the very ancient town of Akhmim, known to the Greeks as Panopolis. And the Red Monastery forms part of a group of three monastic foundations dating from the 5th century BC, AD, 5th century AD, which also include the White Monastery, which was the main monastery of the group, and a women's monastery, which was constructed inside an already existing Greco-Roman period temple at Athribis, Beni Hamed. The great founders of this monastic confederation were Saint Besa on the right-hand side, and his successor, the very well-known Saint Shenouta. Saint Shenouta constructed the White Monastery Church, which we'll look at in a minute, and is well known because his library and copies of original manuscripts dating to his lifetime survived at the White Monastery until the 19th century, when they were borrowed on the non-return basis by European scholars and taken to collections in the West. The Red Monastery Church is so called because, at least the legend goes, that it's built of red brick. But one of the most interesting and striking things about this church is its architectural form, with the slightly battered sloping walls, the cavetto cornice along the top of the walls, and the lion-headed gargoyle which sticks out of the west wall, the back wall of the church, which is all of these very reminiscent of much older indigenous Egyptian styles. which go back well into Egyptian architectural history, such as the example from the Middle Kingdom 4,000 years ago, the top left, continuing through the New Kingdom and into the Roman period with the temple at Der Shawit near Luxor. The temple, which is the building which is most often associated with this style, linking it into the Roman period and the Byzantine period, is the temple at Dendera, where the two lion-headed gargoyles, the cavetto cornice, and the proportions are very reminiscent. It also belongs to a group of churches which survive either ruined or in use still in Upper Egypt. These all date to the 5th century, early 5th century. One is in the temple complex at Dendera, the top left. The other is underneath the mosque of Yusuf Abul Hajjaj in Luxor Temple. And the other is the still functioning White Monastery church constructed by Shenouta in the first half of the 5th century. Notice, at least you can see it here in the mosque in the church under the mosque in Luxor and in the White Monastery. One of the distinctive features are these rows of small windows along the side walls. So coming back to the Red Monastery, and perhaps one could say looking inside the box of the brick walls which surround the church, is there a pointer? No, it doesn't work. Never mind. The church is divided into an interior part here, which is roofed, and an open nave forming the aisle, the colonnaded aisles of a basilica, typical Byzantine basilica. And going down inside, looking towards the east from that open box, the nave of the church, you see this wall which was constructed in 1912 to partition off the interior part of the church, which contains an extraordinary, unique preservation in the form of its architecture and its wall paintings. One column, the black granite column on the left, is the only surviving standing column of the colonnades which once formed the interior of the nave of the basilica. So the wall is a modern feature, but replacing an earlier mud brick wall constructed at some stage in the church's history. So in plan, you're looking at the 1912 wall constructed during the renovations done by the Comité de Conservation des Monuments de l'Art Arabe, and that is the sole surviving column. One of the distinctive features of this church and the White Monastery and the other examples I showed you is this triconch plan of the altar or the sanctuary with its three apses and three semi-domes supporting the main dome. In 2002, Elizabeth Bowman, Gardet Gabra and Abuna Maximus El Anthony brought this church to RC's attention. And we went to have a look at it, and at that time, in 2002, the interior of the church was like this. You can just make out some traces of coloured paintwork, but the apse semi-dome, was entirely blackened by centuries of dirt, incense smoke, candle wax, and so on. In December 2002, two of the Italian wall painting conservators who had been working on RC's projects at St. Anthony's and St. Paul's Monastery went, and this is an example close-up of that dome, and carried out cleaning tests and revealed surviving paintings underneath the layers of dirt that had accumulated over them. This is the face of the Virgin Mary in the middle of the upper semi-dome on the north side. This is the late Adriano Luzzi working on this cleaning test, and it immediately became obvious that a project would be very worthwhile here. Not only were the paintings dirty, but on inspection, getting up on the scaffolding and the ladders, it became clear that some of the painted plaster layers were beginning to detach from the supporting masonry, meaning that it was a now or never rescue project. So looking up into the central dome with those three semi-domes on either side, you can see the cleaning test of the Virgin Mary on the left, another cleaning test on the right-hand side. And There's the cleaning test from the floor, and as the program went on, the paintings were revealed. This layer of paintings is the fourth layer of a series of 4 overlying layers of paintings, which have been dated by Betsy Bollman, Elizabeth Bollman, the art historian and the director of this project at this stage, at this early phase of the project, to no later than the middle of, or the second half of the 7th century AD. The church was constructed, we think, based on style of column capitals to around the year 500, probably slightly earlier, maybe slightly later. And these paintings, therefore, 4 layers represent 150 years of painting and repainting until the last layer was applied at that time. So the entire semidome cleaned, showing in the centre the Virgin Mary nursing the Christ child with the 4 prophets of the Old Testament, Isaiah, Daniel, and I've forgotten the names of the other 2. Sorry, I'm having a senior moment. On the other side, who foretell the incarnation of Christ in the Old Testament. But one of the most striking features about these paintings is the way in which the figures stand in representations of architecture, of columns and arches, which replicate the architecture, the painted architecture of the interior of the church itself. There's a close-up of Isaiah and Daniel with his nice red trousers on. And on the other side, Luigi de Cesaris carrying out a cleaning test on 2 of the evangelists of the New Testament. And this is what they look like cleaned from the floor. And the entire apse when it was cleaned. And in the arcades below are the largest collection of in situ late antique icons anywhere, in the positions where they were painted and where they've been in use ever since. And a close-up of them showing Shanuta on the left and Besa on the right, whom we saw in detail earlier on. And in the eastern apse, instead of icons of saints, the small niches contain representations of curtains representing the veil between the visible and the invisible reality beyond the sanctuary of the church. But the East apse presented us with several dilemmas and perhaps uncomfortable truths. This is a view of it before treatment. There is a cleaning test on the upper left part of the arch, but other than that, this is how it was found, in a very archaeological condition. The later layers of plaster had almost all fallen off, revealing what was the original earliest painted surface applied to the interior of the church, to which we could have access. It certainly survives underneath the later layers in other parts of the church, but here it was exposed because the later layers had fallen down. Cleaning tests revealed 2 phases of painting. In fact, the face of the Archangel Michael on the left-hand side belongs to that 4th layer that I was talking about, but the red outline drawing at the top right-hand side represents the outline drawings done by the first artist who worked on the first plaster layer on the masonry of the church. It dates, therefore, to about 500. Elizabeth Bollman would like to date it slightly earlier, in the late 5th century, based on parallels, the only parallels to this that she's found, which are in a church in northern Italy, near Milan, emphasizing the enormous interconnectivity of the Mediterranean world in this early Byzantine, late antique period. This is a close-up of the Archangel Michael and that later layer cleaned, and here you see traces of that earlier red outline drawing underneath. And when the whole apse was cleaned, it came out like this. You can see at the top where the later layers are missing, it's exposed a painting, or drawing one should perhaps say better, which was the preparation for a painting which was later painted. But the reason that the drawing, the sketching, has survived and not the painting is that when the later layers fell off, they pulled all the pigment layer off the paint, preserving the drawing, because this is an accidental fresco, because the artist started making the drawings before the lime wash was dry, so it fused with the lime wash and is preserved. This is the traditional fresco technique used by the Romans and later in the Renaissance, but in Egypt all painting is done secco, on dry plaster. The only Roman frescoes that survive anywhere intact are in Luxor Temple, which is another lecture altogether. But here, this is an accidental fresco, and it's a miracle that it has survived. Elizabeth Bowman again has identified this as the remains of an ascension scene with two angels here and the central figure of Christ, and all these blotches down here and larger elements are the remains of the later fourth phase painting that originally covered the whole dome. But if you look at this in detail, you can see that amongst all these black specks there are traces of that later painting. And here you can see the outline of a mandorla, or the body halo, that goes around Christ. And here are a pair of eyes, and part of a beard, and the shoulders and arms, and the outline of the book, the closed book that he's holding, and the drapery of the knees. Now here we were faced with a dilemma, because for the purists and the art historians, the glimpse of that very early painting is important. For the purists, as the Venice Charter says, reconstruction must stop where imagination begins. But for the faithful of the Church, an archaeological display such as this is not relevant to their use of the Church and their experience of the Church. They need icons that they can recognise. So the wall painting conservators, having gone through an elaborate series of all of us involved in the project, looking at computer renditions of what that later layer painting might have looked like, began to join up the dots. This is a close-up of the face over the earlier paintings, and using a technique which is in Italian called acqua sporca, dirty water, which is a technique using the mixture of modern watercolours. They were able to join up the dots of the missing sections, recreate this in a way that is visible from the floor, but leaving as much of the original painting on the first plaster layer visible, so that a kind of series of overlaying layers is presented all at the same time with the minimum of obscurity, so that from the floor it looks like this. This is also an important conservation measure, because as I mentioned, for the faithful of the Church, they need icons they can recognise. And if we had left this, had we left this in its archaeological, very ruined condition, it's quite likely that somebody without the right training would have put up a ladder and tried to do it themselves. And so, in a sense, having an expert team who has worked intimately with these paintings by this time for 10 years, go up there and do it in this, this way, acts also as a conservation measure. And I think it still corresponds with the intention of that article of the Venice Charter. And from the floor, looking up with the lighting installed, the interior looks like this now. Another aspect, of course, of an Eastern church is that the sanctuary or the altar is exclusive for clergy, and is cut off from the laity who stay outside the sacred space of the altar. And another lengthy negotiation took place as to how this altar area, the sanctuary of the church, would be presented to visitors, because part of the USAID agenda is that tourism and economic support for the monastery and for Egypt is an important component of the work. And according to the Venice Charter, the building must be brought into some socially useful purpose, and this building has a socially useful purpose, which is as a church. So there was no doubt, while the project was going on, that once the work had finished in here, it would become a church again and be used. And again, this is a conservation measure, because the people who most cherish this church and give it its greatest value and significance are the users of the church. So, in order to allow access, visual access, so that visitors can see the results of the conservation project, rather than installing a high screen, which would have obscured the entire interior, the clergy, the priest in charge, Abuna Antonius, the Antiquities Ministry, and the main group of stakeholders, interest groups, all agreed on installing this low railing, which allows about a 95% view of the interior. And not only is it, of course, a church for visibility, so that people can see what the inside of a church looks like, but also has been brought back into use as a church, and this is Abuna Antonius at the altar. Now, stepping outside into the unroofed nave, the roof was lost many centuries ago. This is that view again, looking towards the altar, the sanctuary, from the outside, before any conservation work had started. And it was important that the interior, having gone through this long conservation program, which had turned it from a ruin into an extremely attractive and also scholarly, academically important monument, should be connected to this outer part of the church, which is the first part of the church that visitors arrive in. It's also the part of the church in which local people gather, the community gathers, and in which on summer evenings Abuna Antonius will host visitors and speak with them, talk with them. So the first thing was to plaster the 1912 Comité wall, as we call it, and also to erect a complete column and put on it an original column, which was lying against the wall of the church, and to erect on top of it an original Corinthian column capital. And looking the other way, turning exactly 180 degrees from the last picture, this is what the other end of the nave looked like before conservation work started. You can see original granite column fragments rolled against the wall, and also an enormous amount of archaeological information on the vertical. Some of the most significant parts of this are, of course, that's the interior of the cornice that you saw from the outside, the roofings, the roof beam slots, where the timber roof slotted into the walls, the joist holes for the floor of the gallery, which rested on the side aisles, like the Church of Abu Sargan today is a good parallel to this. And so before we started any work on dealing with the interior of the nave, the first thing was an archaeological excavation. This established the position of original column bases here, and remains of the original pavement, and also the stylobates between the columns. And whenever you have 2 points, you join them up, it makes a straight line. So we were able to establish at least this corner of the original foundations, which is all that survives of the basilica nave. 2 more excavation trenches picked up the traces elsewhere, and it enabled us to begin an anastomosis project in the nave of replacing the pavement and also laying out the positions of the columns and re-erecting the column fragments that survived on new bases. This again, conservation measure, because the granite columns are a lot safer standing up than they are lying down on the ground. And another view of the process. And original architectural elements, partly revealed in the excavation and partly they had been above ground beforehand, incorporated into the reconstruction. And this is what it looks like looking towards the Comité wall. And to one side, there are many blocks of original architecture which just couldn't be fitted back in to the reconstruction, and so a seating area was made around a disused well and a display of these objects made there. Place to sit and a place to have your photograph taken. And lit at night, because as I said, the night time is the time when, particularly in the summer, when community members gather in this nave. And now it was time to start on the walls. The walls of the church have, over the course of the project, revealed quite a lot of architectural history which has changed the perception of this building. The Italian wall painting Conservators started work on the nave in 2014, and with cleaning tests began to discover that under the black and dirty walls there were the traces of paintings. These paintings were exposed to the sun for many centuries, and many of the pigments have disappeared. The pigments that survive are now stable because the binding agents in the paint have mineralized and stabilized. But rather than the very bright preservation of the interior of the sanctuary, here we have less preservation of paint layers, but still a significant amount of colour preserved. And this photograph was taken about this time last year, showing progress on cleaning the walls. Above the gallery level, which would have been on the same level as the top of the complete columns, above that level there are no paintings. It's a plain white plaster, and below that level are a series of monumental crosses, decorative crosses like the one you see here, and this one in the centre of the west wall. And as we found at the end of the last season, in December last year, these elaborate crosses bear much more resemblance to paintings in manuscripts than they do to many examples of wall paintings, with this interlacing design. And this particular one has these two rather endearing unicorns drinking from the cross. And on the north wall, besides the crosses, we have traces here in two cleaning tests of a mounted equestrian saint. You can see the face of the horse here and the rear part of the horse and the saint's cloak billowing out. Unfortunately, somebody at some stage cut a niche in the wall just where the saint's head would be. So by the end of last year, the upper parts are cleaned and work is progressing on the lower parts of the walls. But this isn't just about visibility. And I'm going to come back to this now, proceeding on to, I think, the second part of the project in a way, the second part of the title that's on the poster, involving community. Because the Red Monastery Church doesn't just stand in splendid isolation. Many pictures of it will just focus on the building itself and ignore what is in fact the most important component of this place. And that is Abuna Antonius's own development plans, which are recognisable here in the new churches, the guest room, the men's guest rooms, the women's guest rooms, family guest rooms, the reception rooms, the shops, the workshops, carpentry workshop off here, metal workshops and so on, all of which he has developed in the last 10 to 15 years. And of course there is the surrounding village. The foreground shows where there was an unrecorded archaeological excavation in the 1990s, and this area now has been developed for car parking to take vehicles away from the church itself. The interest groups range from scholars to tourists to the local faithful at the Mulid. They come in thousands, And although visitor wear and tear is probably an understatement concerning the effect of these people, these are the people who value this place, perhaps more than anyone else, on a value which works through instinctive faith rather than academic study or touristic interest. So we conducted a visitor survey. This is Dina Bachum, who is working with me. She's an essential part of our liaison with the community at the Red Monastery, and also with our work with the Antiquities Ministry. And it was quite interesting to record what visitors had to say. One man, an elderly man, who had grown up in Sohag and who knew the Red Monastery Church as a child, emigrated with his family to Australia about 40 years ago, walked in and looked at it and said, "This is not how I remember it." Whether this was a positive or a negative statement, we never really worked out. But this lady, being interviewed by Dina, was generally positive. She liked the idea that you could sit down on something clean in the church. And she was very responsive also to the fact that somebody had actually asked her responses and was interested in what her reaction was. All our work is done in collaboration with the Antiquities Ministry. This is Nicholas Warner with the turquoise cap, who has directed all the anastomosis work and architectural study of the church. Here at one of our meetings on site a couple of years ago, discussing the plans for that anastomosis work with representatives of the ministry. And one of the projects which Dina has developed with Abuna Antonius and his dogs is a program for young ladies from the community around, from Sohag, all of whom have graduated from Sohag University in aspects of archaeology or conservation, but who don't seem to know very much about it. And they come in classes, mixed Muslim and Christian groups, and Dina talks about the received history of the church. Abuna Antonius will challenge that with the church's traditional view of the history of the church, and often there are extremely lively debates developed. And this is another way of engaging a component of the community who in many cases would be neglected and excluded from this kind of awareness program. And the same group of the young ladies engaging also with the Italian wall painting conservators in what conservation is about, why we do it, how we do it, and what is it for. Ultimately, of course, the answer is it's for them. And another part of this program, which is run by the Italian wall painting conservators, is hands-on training for conservators from the Ministry of Antiquities. We run a program which involves the ministry training sector advertising on their Facebook page. Conservators in the ministry apply, we interview them in Luxor, and about sometimes 10, some years we've had 15 successful applicants then join the team on site. This is Alberto Succato in the middle, giving a technical lesson, but it also involves hands-on training on the walls themselves. And there's Dina at the bottom right. On the left is Alberto Succato again, and in the background, peeping between the scaffolding, is Issam Rushdie, who is head of conservation for the Antiquities Ministry in Sohag. And an example of that hands-on work, the top left, Emiliano Albanese is showing this young lady how to listen to detached plaster, because the space between the detached plaster and the supporting masonry has to be filled to prevent falling off of the plaster. And it's essential that you know, by listening, you can gauge the kind of cavity there is inside. Having done so, at the top right, she drills a hole. Bottom left, she injects consolidant plaster. If you put too little in, of course, it's ineffective. If you put too much in, it will burst the plaster off the surface. And then she fills the tiny hole with modern mortar. But the proof of a conservation project is way beyond the lifetimes of the people who work on it. We don't know how long any of this work will last. The paintings in the church have lasted since the 6th, 7th centuries. If the Conservators' work lasts as long, which I doubt that it will, because it will get dirty again and have to be cleaned again, then it is for these next generations of people. The church is a community centre as well as a religious centre. Abuna Antonius is developing this church for that community, and it is these future generations for whom this is being done. And finally, here they are, sitting in the nave, enjoying it and learning about it. And thank you very much. No.
Thank you very much. I suspect some of us might have some questions that we want to pose for Michael. So, please, is there anyone who'd like to? Lauren.
Put the light on.
Oh yes.
You might not be able to see the unicorn so well.
I was just wondering, in the central sanctuary, under the central dome, I mean, now it's covered by carpets, but there are remains of a column base.
Like a short column.
Yes.
Yes.
So I was just wondering if this, like, where does this fall in the chronology of?
We don't know. These columns, they're about this high. There's one in the White Monastery in a similar position. There's one in Der Shuhada in Esna, but not in the same sort of, it's in a room in front of the Chorus and that Heikel church. They're very unusual, but there are these 3 known examples. If anyone knows of any more, then it would be interesting to know. But we don't know what they're for. They're all reused in their present circumstances. They all have a kind of square notch in the top, which is probably from when they were actually used as a column where the capital fitted on it. And various explanations have been put forward as whether it was to hold a candle or a basin with water in it or something, but it's not actually used now. And we took the one out in the Red Monastery in order to do the work of repaving inside. And the Abunas, all of them, were unanimous that they didn't want it put back because it was in the way. So we, of course, had some negotiating on conservation principles, and we put it back with the backing of the Antiquities authorities. So yes, I can't answer functional question, but as a feature of early churches in Upper Egypt, it's an interesting one.
And just, this is a bit of a naive question, but is there any dispute between RC and the German concession after this?
No.
About?
No, we're completely not that. In fact, we're working with their conservators, not officially working on site, but in conversation with them, assisting them with ideas about the training program, for example, because they want to set up a training program there for antiquities inspectors, and Dean has been giving advice and so on how to do that. So yes, it's a collaboration. It's a collaborative effort. Yes.
One thing I wanted to ask you, I'm not sure that everyone would be familiar with this term, anastomosis.
Oh yes, it's a Greek word. If you do a reconstruction, well basically it describes what you saw in the pictures in the nave of restoring a pavement or re-erecting columns, basically not lying down, literally. So yeah, anastomosis. It's a word that's in a jargon word perhaps, but one that you'll find in the literature on this theory. But one thing perhaps I should add before people go is that if you go away with one thing, one idea from this, it is that it's not the church that really matters. It's what people think the church is that matters. And nothing has any value or significance unless people give it value and significance. And that value and significance might change over centuries. For example, the pyramids weren't built as tourist destination. They've been reinvented for a modern value, an economic one, and also a scholarly one, an academic one, and a general interest one, which is what tourists bring. The church has the same values. It was built as a church, as the basilica, in a functioning monastic community. It would have had visitors from outside, but its function from the beginning was as a church. From the 19th century onwards, foreigners got interested in all this through scholarly, academic, or other reasons. And the 19th and 20th century literature in foreign languages generally focuses on that. And if you think about it, for the art historian, this church is an art gallery. For Bruno Antonius, it is a vision of heaven. And so these two interest groups are equally valid, and they are what make the building important. And it's not just this one, of course, it's every historic building for one reason or another. And if you're looking at pharaonic buildings, of which the original socially useful purpose now no longer exists, they have been reinvented and given new socially useful purposes, which is the value and significance that people give them now, and which is why they survive. Because when people didn't value them, they just got recycled into other buildings. They were demolished and their materials reused. And so please take away with you this idea that it's incredibly important to appreciate community when you're looking at these buildings. And there is no substitute for the interface, the relationship which has to be created between the project, the managers and directors of the project, the interest groups, and the local community. All this has to come together. And we're not always that successful at it, I can tell you. But what I've hoped to show are some fleeting glimpses of ways in which this does seem to work. Gary.
Since you speak of the community, in terms of a pre-21st century, have you found such things as wells, latrines, mills for grinding flour, or I mean, how did
from the monastic occupation?
Yes.
The excavation that the SCA did on the outside of the church uncovered what are the remains of some sort of industrial area. There's a deep well, and there are water channels, and then there are pottery vats set in the ground, which are probably something to do with the dyeing industry, fabric dyeing industry. Fabric dyeing is well known from Shenuta's writing as one of the economies of these monasteries. And other than that, there isn't very much at the Red Monastery. One reason is that a lot of it is now built over all around by the village that's encroached on it. I think quite a lot of it might have disappeared underneath Bruno Antonius' new churches. But at the White Monastery, just down the road, there is extensive archaeological remains which have been excavated, including what are some sort of residential and domestic buildings, administrative buildings, and also industrial parts as well. We know more from the writings of Shenuta about what the monastery would have been doing than we do about the archaeological remains at the sites. In the women's monastery remains at Athribis, there's very well preserved refectory with these big circular tables on the floor where they sat round. Yes.
This is gonna sound a bit odd. So I appreciate a lot what you guys did with the existing religious leader and the existing community. I just wanted to ask, so you've done a lot of stuff related to sustainability in terms of training local, local people technically, but what do you think can be done for sustainability on a financial level? Like once USAID or whatever the fund is dries out, how do you consolidate that with, okay, we've trained people, but they don't, like, who can do the upkeep and protect this obvious heritage, but they need money to be able to do that, and they need materials for that. How, is there any way that has been, like,
This is a very good question.